Welcome back, everyone. It is Dr. Lindner. What we're going to be talking about in this brief, short section is going to be body cavities and membranes. So, one of the main functions of body cavities are different chambers within the human body where organs are going to be kept, and it protects those organs against accidental shocks. And it also gives a little bit of room for the organ to change in their size and shape. Okay. When we look at cavities, we're going to divide them into anterior and posterior. When we look at the anterior side, we're going to be focusing on a thoracic cavity and an abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, within the thoracic cavity, there's two. There's one for the lungs, and the other is for the heart. Lungs we call pleural, and heart pericardial. For the abdominal pelvic, we're going to focus on the peritoneal cavity, peritoneal, which is where most of our digestive organs are kept, and then the pelvic cavity for the reproductive portion. All of these fall within the anterior chamber. On the posterior, we're going to have the cranial cavity for the brain, and we're going to have the vertebral cavity for the spinal cord and the meninges, okay? The cerebral spinal fluid, that's all on the posterior part. Cranial cavity for the brain, vertebral cavity for the spinal cord. Okay, so what do we have? Oh, let me go back here for a second. There's one more thing I wanted to point out. I wanted to point out the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is this muscle that separates, right? Here's the diaphragm right there. It's that muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And what's unique about the diaphragm is that it has attachments to the heart and to the spine. Diaphragm is really important muscle, okay? But it does separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. So here, this is the cranial cavity. This is the vertebral cavity. Right here, this is either thoracic cavity or pleural cavity for the lungs. Here's the diaphragm. And then the purple is the peritoneum for the digestive organs. And then this is the pelvic cavity for the reproductive organs. This has been a drag and drop. So we're talking about now, again, posterior, which is the same as dorsal. And then you have anterior, which is ventral. So we have a dorsal cavity, and then you have a ventral cavity. So in the dorsal cavity, you have the cranial cavity, vertebral cavity, spinal cord back there, and the protective meninges that cover the spinal cord. In the ventral cavity in the front, you got the abdominal cavity, you got the lungs, you got the diaphragm, and an area called the mediastinum, which is the region between the lungs and the heart. That's the mediastinum, between the heart and the lungs. Now, when we talk about these cavities, there's two terms that I want you to keep in mind. One of them is called the parietal layer, and the other is a visceral layer. The visceral layer is going to cover the organ, and the parietal is going to cover the cavity. So if your fist pushes into a balloon, let's say your fist is the heart, there's a layer of the balloon that comes into contact with your fist or the organ, and that's going to be the visceral layer. Then the other part of the balloon is on the outer portion, which is going to line the cavity or the right? Like if it's the lungs or the heart, it's going to be on the outer portion. That's called the parietal layer. So there's a visceral layer and a parietal layer. The visceral layer comes into contact with the viscera, which is the organ. In this case, it's the heart. So we call it the visceral pericardium. Peri means around. It's going around the heart. Then we have the outer portion this way, which is the parietal pericardium. And between the visceral and the parietal is the pericardial cavity. Pericardial cavity. It's filled with fluid. Remember, the heart is a muscle. It's beating many, many, many times. It generates heat. So this fluid cools it off. So visceral pericardium, parietal pericardium. And the pericardial cavity is between the two. Now, if it was lungs, all we're doing is changing pericardium to plural. Visceral pleura, parietal pleura. If it's where the small intestines and stomach is, and we just call it the visceral peritoneum and parietal peritoneum. Okay, just keep that in mind. So again, parietal is going to line the cavity, whereas visceral is going to cover the organ. So now let's look at the heart and the lungs together. So when we look at the inner part of the heart, which is right here, that's the visceral layer, and because it's the heart, it's the visceral pericardium. When we look at the outer part of the heart, going all the way around, that is the parietal layer. Since it's the heart, it's the parietal pericardium. And again, the cavity between the two, that's filled with fluid, that's the pericardial cavity. Let's look at the lungs. Remember, lungs are called pleura. Same concept applies. If we're talking about the layer that's closest to the organ itself, here, that's the visceral pleura. If we're talking about the layer all the way on the outside that lines the actual cavity itself, that's the parietal pleura. And then between the two, we have a pleural cavity. Same thing. Oh, so this was one that showed up on one of the Connect quizzes. So what is the highlighted structure? That happens to be the part that's closest to the organ, which is the visceral pericardium. If it was the black line here, then it would be parietal pericardium. Okay, but it's asking for the blue, so it would be visceral pericardium. Now, when we look at the abdominal pelvic region, again, we see the word parietal and visceral, but now we're using the word peritoneum for the gastrointestinal organs. So here is the liver, here is the stomach, here is the large intestine, this is small intestine. So when we look at the blue line that's covering this entire cavity, all of it, this is called the parietal peritoneum. Visceral peritoneum would be if I'm talking about this, going around here, going around the liver. That would be a visceral peritoneum. Going around the stomach, visceral peritoneum. But surrounding all of those combined is the parietal peritoneum. I want to point out the pancreas back here and the kidneys back here. Notice they are behind the blue. When they're behind it, we use the word retroperitoneum. Retroperitoneum means it's behind the parietal peritoneum. And that's why cancers of the pancreas are so painful. It's held tightly on the posterior thorax and that peritoneum. So when it gets enlarged, it's very, very pain sensitive. Same with the kidneys. Okay. Um, okay, so let's bring this to an end here, and we'll see